When Christine moved, she took the equity from her home that basically we as a family had bought her.
I mean, you still want to build?
Don't you?
Well,
Friends, it's me, Mirab, and I welcome you once again to Starspill USA, where today's story is not the glossy television version you have been shown, not the carefully edited narratives designed for an hour of entertainment, but the raw, unfiltered, unvarnished truth of a family empire crumbling in real time. A truth that burst into the unforgiving fluorescent light of a Clark County courtroom and left nothing but dust and ruin in its wake. It was a moment that seemed to still the very air, as though every second of 12 seasons of Sister Wives had been building relentlessly towards this single explosion. There stood Kody Brown, a man who for decades styled himself as husband, father, patriarch, and leader. And there in the dock, his carefully polished image cracked so violently that it did not merely fracture, it detonated. Those within the courtroom who later whispered their accounts describe a voice, once known to charm or cajole or browbeat, depending on the day, now raw, jagged, and utterly unrestrained. They tell us his bellow reverberated against the polished wooden walls, echoing in every corner, as he allegedly declared himself not just head of house but absolute ruler, the singular authority over the Browns. And most damning of all, master and commander of every penny that flowed in or out of the family's coffers. That confession, screamed in fury, was not only a declaration of dominance but the very words that sealed his undoing. This was no longer about tearful confessionals on the family sofa or emotional spats edited into primetime drama. This was about hard cash, legal accountability, shattered trust, and the narcissistic tirade that buried Kody Brown beneath the very empire he had worked so ruthlessly to build. To truly grasp how such a moment arrived, we must travel back not a few weeks, not a handful of months, but years, to the very roots of both the family's fortune and its disintegration, Coyote Pass, that barren stretch of Arizona land that was supposed to be their promised land, their legacy, their great shared dream, and which today lies not as a monument of unity but as a hollow, mocking symbol of everything that went wrong. When first introduced, Coyote Pass was marketed as destiny itself, a sweeping estate where first one grand home, then for separate dwellings would rise from the dust, providing each wife her domain and together cementing the Brown family as a singular dynasty. Instead, it became a wasteland of half-plans, empty promises, and mounting resentment. The program showed us glimpses of frustration, the occasional tear, the familiar refrain of someday. But what the cameras never captured, what only whispers behind closed doors revealed, was that Coyote Pass was not merely a dream deferred, but a financial time bomb, and one that would ultimately detonate in the worst possible way. At the center of this storm was Janelle Brown, the ever-pragmatic, ever-practical wife, who, unlike her co-sister Christine, was rarely emotional, who, unlike Mary, was rarely indulged in drama, and who, unlike Robyn, never seemed to demand more than her fair share. Janelle had poured not only her belief, but the bulk of her life savings into what was presented to her as the family's collective investment. The premise, as she understood it, was straightforward. Every wife contributed, and in return, every wife shared. The pool of money was not hers, nor his, nor theirs alone. It was family money, one pot, managed, and this was the crucial point, by the man who styled himself not only patriarch but chief executive officer of the Brown estate, Kody. For years, this arrangement was tolerated, sometimes begrudgingly, sometimes resignedly, but tolerated nonetheless. Yet when Christine, weary of neglect and control, walked away, and later when Janelle herself realized the structure could not hold, the critical question could no longer be ignored. What becomes of the investment? Where does the money go? Whose future is safeguarded and whose is erased? According to those closest to the matter, Janelle attempted again and again to resolve this privately. In the closing months of 2022 and the early months of 2023, she placed calm but insistent calls to Kody, asking not for favors but for clarity. She sought a straightforward mechanism, a buyout, an equity cash-out. A parcel sold so that she might take her portion and begin the next chapter of her life unburdened. What she encountered instead was stonewalling, arrogance, and dismissal. Kody's alleged responses were cutting. There was no such thing as her portion. The money was indivisible, the land indivisible, the dream indivisible. To ask otherwise, he claimed, was not businesslike but disloyal, not pragmatic but destructive. Her request was reframed time and again as betrayal. And when she suggested selling even a slice of land to free her equity, the answer was reportedly that such an act would destroy the integrity of the estate, undermine the family's grand vision, and punish the loyal members, a phrase which, sources are clear, meant himself and Robyn Brown, the so-called favorite wife. The woman often accused by fans of being both Kody's salvation and his ruination, was central in this, for every refusal, every justification seemed ultimately to protect not the collective but the pair who now moved increasingly as a unit. Kody and Robyn against the world. At last Janelle pushed beyond the limits of patience, took the only step left to her. She hired legal representation. From that moment forward, this saga ceased to be family drama and became financial war. For whilst Kody turned to a flamboyant Las Vegas lawyer, famed less for his diligence than his theatrics, Janelle sought the opposite. A boutique firm with partners notorious for forensic precision, specialists in tearing apart complicated partnership finances and exposing every hidden trail. To them, this was not about marriage, not about love, not about religion. It was a partnership dissolution, and the law would treat it as such. The battlefield would be numbers, and the weapon would be forensic accounting. When individuals pool resources without strict documentation, and one person exercises unilateral control, the risk is catastrophic. Breach of fiduciary duty, when the trustee acts for himself rather than those he represents, is not merely unethical, is legally actionable. And unjust enrichment profiting unfairly at the expense of another is a dagger that cuts straight to the heart of equity. It was upon these blades that Janelle's counsel built their case. For months, quietly, without drama, they subpoenaed bank records, deposed former accountants, examined property transfers from Utah, Las Vegas, and Arizona. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed until at last they found it. The linchpin, the smoking gun, the undeniable transfer. $385,000. Moved from the Central Brown family account, the very account flush with cash after the sale of their Las Vegas homes. An account to which both Janelle and even Mary had contributed from their own house sales into a private investment fund, and whose names were on that fund. Not the Brown Family Trust. Not the Sister Wives Partnership. Not Kody, Janelle, Christine, Mary, Robyn. Solely and exclusively Kody and Robyn Brown. That single transfer. That act of siphoning became the keystone of the entire case. For it was no longer vague, no longer blurred, no longer lost in the murk of one big family pot. It was specific, documented, undeniable. And when it surfaced, the edifice of Kody's grand defense began to collapse. His legal team's strategy, it turns out, had been built upon arrogance. They would present Kody not as flawed, but as misunderstood. Not as negligent, but as visionary. Not as selfish, but as sacrificial. He would be cast as King Lear, tragic patriarch betrayed by those he had served. They would insist that the family was no mere partnership and so could not be judged by conventional standards. They would claim opacity was intentional. The finances deliberately one pot, too entangled to untangle, unfair to dissect. They would not paint Janelle as wicked, but as weak, influenced by Christine's bitterness, swayed into rebellion. It was theater, pure theater. And perhaps in Kody's mind, conditioned by years of playing to the camera? Certain that his charisma could turn any tide, it might even have seemed plausible. But in the courtroom, where evidence speaks louder than ego, it was a doomed performance. For whilst his lawyer thundered, Janelle's lawyers calmly placed before the judge the record of that transfer. The black and white proof of money diverted for the benefit of two at the expense of many. And in that instant, the Mud Kody's team tried to sling settled only around their own feet, making them look not tragic, but guilty. Not misunderstood, but manipulative. Not betrayed, but betrayer. Thus it was that in the sterile courtroom, stripped of the soft focus lens, the sympathetic edits, the confessional background music, the Brown family's grand facade unraveled. And Kody Brown, once self-proclaimed CEO of his sprawling clan, found himself reduced to a man caught in the very web of greed. Control and secrecy he had spun. Janelle's team had the paperwork, and when confronted with this in discovery, Kody's team attempted to lean back on their carefully rehearsed strategy, insisting with theatrical confidence that what had been exposed was nothing more than a complex relocation of assets, a strategic move that the patriarch had made in order to safeguard the family's future in what he described as a more secure and stable investment. And whilst to the untrained ear it may have sounded plausible, to those who knew the cold mechanics of finance, it rang hollow. For words are wind, but numbers are granite. And Janelle's team refused to let rhetoric cover what the documents revealed. They pressed further, subpoenaing the records of that private account. And what they uncovered was not the noble safeguard of a visionary father, but the damning ledger of a man, funneling communal wealth into a private kingdom. The trail showing expenditure after expenditure that bore no resemblance to collective interest, and instead painted a picture of indulgence and favoritism, including significant stock purchases designed to grow personal portfolios, a hefty down payment on a luxury SUV registered solely in Robyn's name, extravagant payments made to an interior decorator to adorn only Robyn's home, and most devastating of all, a substantial sum wired out to extinguish pre-existing debts Robyn had carried before she ever joined the family. Personal obligations from her former life now wiped clean with money that belonged not to her, nor to Kody, but to every wife who had sacrificed in good faith. It was, as the legal analysts would later call it, the kill shot, the moment where any pretense of family stewardship collapsed. For however Kody's lawyers wished to spin his authority as patriarch or CEO of Brown Family Incorporated, no principle of law, partnership, or equity permitted the taking of communal funds to pay the personal debts of one favored spouse. And what in the corporate world would be labeled embezzlement here became an undeniable breach of fiduciary duty and an act of financial malfeasance, an unarguable betrayal of trust that could not be excused, explained, or buried beneath sentimental appeals. Armed with this missile, Janelle's team sharpened their strategy, preparing not to dismantle Kody with aggression, but to allow him to dismantle himself, to let him ascend the pedestal of his own ego and speak freely until the trapdoor gave way beneath his feet. And so when the trial opened, the atmosphere inside that Clark County courtroom was described as electric, charged with the energy of a television finale, but stripped of soft lighting and sympathetic edits, leaving only raw tension and the knowledge that lives and fortunes were about to be redrawn. Janelle entered composed, her bearing professional, eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to yield even a flicker of acknowledgement to the pair who followed behind. Kody and Robyn hand in hand, presenting a united front. The patriarch in a suit too tight across the shoulders, straining as though trying to contain the bulk of a man desperate to project power. And Robyn dressed conservatively, a portrait carefully crafted of loyalty and quiet support. The opening statements could not have been more stark in their contrast. Kody's lawyer thundered for 45 minutes, weaving scripture and persecution into his performance, casting his client as a flawed but noble shepherd crushed beneath the weight of guiding a rebellious flock, framing the proceedings not as a question of dollars but as a tragedy of faith and family fractured. Janelle's lawyer, by comparison, spoke with surgical precision, cutting through the fog with a statement barely 10 minutes long, declaring unequivocally that the case was not about religion, nor marriage, nor even the soap opera of reality television, but about a broken business partnership and a man who had taken funds entrusted to him and diverted them for his personal gain. promising the court that the evidence would speak with a clarity no rhetoric could conceal, and that this case was about one word only: accountability. Over the next days, Janelle's team began erecting their wall of evidence brick by brick, their forensic accountant testifying methodically, guiding the judge through the labyrinth of family finances, showing how the shared pot had once flowed evenly and then, slowly, had begun to funnel disproportionately towards Kody and Robyn until it became a private stream. And during these sessions, Kody was observed sighing, shifting, his hands clenching, his head shaking as though the very facts being recited were personal insults. His frustration visible, while his lawyer, unfazed, offered little in rebuttal, saving every ounce of energy for the crescendo they believed would save their client. The moment Kody himself took the stand. At last that day arrived, and with it the beginning of what those present now call the narcissistic rant that entered Brown family history. Called by his own defense, Kody strode to the witness chair with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, his smile broad as he greeted the judge, as though he were not the defendant in a financial case, but the star of a program returning to his set. And as he swore the oath and settled himself, the room braced for the performance they knew was coming, though none realized just how damning it would prove. His lawyer, with questions soft as silk, invited him to speak not to facts but to narrative. And for nearly 2 hours, Kody did precisely that, sermonizing from the stand as though it were his pulpit, describing the family not as a financial partnership but as a sacred covenant, insisting that every decision he had ever made was for the good of the family, that he bore the crushing weight of leadership as both patriarch and CEO, the only one with the vision to steer the ship whilst the wives concerned themselves with the trivialities of daytude, painting himself as a martyr of duty, a man persecuted by outsiders, betrayed by those within, yet still carrying the torch of their mission. He cast the move from Utah not as financial maneuvering, but as an act of courage, an escape from persecution, and the relocation to Flagstaff as visionary, the purchase of Coyote Pass framed as nothing less than destiny. He mourned Janelle's departure in tones of sorrow, calling her his buddy, his pal, a loss that broke his heart. And yet he laid blame not upon her, but upon Christine, whom he accused of poisoning Janelle's loyalty with bitterness, painting Christine as a victim-turned-villain whose resentment had spread like a contagion. Over and again, he reminded the court that the family was not and never had been about pennies, but about heaven, that counting pennies was beneath the calling of their covenant, and that those who now picked apart accounts had lost sight of the mission. Observers later remarked it was less testimony than homily, less evidence than ego, a man enthralled by his own voice, convinced that conviction alone could overwrite documentation, that passion could erase paper trails. But Janelle's lawyers had not interrupted, had not objected, had not sought to cut him down, because this was the moment they had laid in wait for. The pedestal built high by his own words. The pedestal from which they would push him with one simple question: how paying off? Robyn's personal pre-marriage debts could possibly have served the family. Kody, with his chest puffed and his voice steady at first, explained the family finances as something fluid, something sacred almost, describing them as a complex organism where money flowed like lifeblood to wherever it was needed. A system, he insisted, that no outsider could ever understand because it required faith in him as the conduit, the channel, the patriarch who directed that flow for the maximum benefit of the whole. And for 25 years, he claimed that trust had been absolute, unwavering, the very bedrock of Brown Family Incorporated. Until now, until betrayal had poisoned it. And in declaring this, in announcing that the system functioned on one thing only, absolute trust in him, he unknowingly placed the final brick on the pedestal. His enemies were about to shatter. And so, when his lawyer concluded the gentle questioning, the court turned to Janelle's counsel and reading, who rose not with piles of papers but with a single thin folder, a piece of theater as sharp as any cross-examination could be. signaling to the judge and all assembled that her case was simple, deadly, and required only a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. The hush that fell was thick, the air charged with anticipation. And readingsvoice.com/pleasant, almost disarmingly polite, began not with fury, but with foundation, asking Kody to reaffirm the very words he had just spoken under oath. His title as self-appointed CEO of Brown Family Incorporated, the role he himself had fashioned as both patriarch and financial steward, and having him acknowledge step by step that with such a role came a fiduciary duty, a responsibility recognized even in the language of the law, to act in the best interests of all partners, all wives, all contributors in that corporation. Kody began to hedge at once, speaking of duty to the entity as a whole, not the individuals, but reading, relentless and calm. Pressed until he conceded that what was good for the whole must by necessity be fair to its constituent members. And already the cracks in his fortress of rhetoric began to show. She then circled back to his proud declaration that the wives trusted him absolutely, confirming that this trust meant he was to manage their money transparently, with accountability for the benefit of everyone. And though he waved it off, claiming the women had never troubled themselves with large-scale finances and simply entrusted his vision to lead them to the promised land of Coyote Pass, his words only confirmed the authority he wielded and the duty that such authority demanded. Then, with the room silent and Kody's confidence still visible, Reading at last opened her folder, producing the document labeled Plaintiff's Exhibit 42. The bank statement, the $385,000 question. Sliding it towards him with surgical calm, observers say his posture shifted the instant his eyes landed on the page, his shoulders tightening as the mask of confidence began to falter. For here in black and white was the statement from the Brown Family LLC account, flush with cash after the sale of the Las Vegas homes, and here too was the line item, the wire transfer of $385,000 that had vanished from that communal pot. Reading asked him simply if he saw it, and after a long pause he acknowledged that he did. Then came Exhibit 43, the statement for the private investment account into which that money had flowed. And with gritted teeth he read aloud the names on the account, his own, and Robyn's, and no one else's. He scrambled then to his rehearsed line, declaring it a strategic reallocation of assets, protection against risk, a safeguard for the family, but Reading pounced, forcing him to confirm his own testimony that it remained family money, entrusted and meant for all, including Janelle, whose proceeds from her home sale were part of that sum. And though he dismissed the names on the account as a mere formality, she produced Exhibit 44, the transaction history for that so-called formality account, and began her dissection item by item. First, a $28,000 payment, which Kody feigned not to recall until Reading refreshed his memory with forensic precision, noting that it matched exactly the payoff of a Victoria's Secret credit card held in Robyn's maiden name. Debt she had accrued before she even entered the family. Personal debt now erased with Janelle's contributions. Kody's face reddened, his jaw tightening. And he countered with the audacious claim that when Robyn joined the family, her debt became family debt. Reading's response was devastating in its simplicity. Had he informed Janelle that her money was being used to pay off Robyn's old bills? Kody's voice rose in anger as he snapped that as head of the family. He didn't need Janelle's permission to make every little financial decision. But Reading was already moving on, pointing next to a $65,000 payment to a Lexus dealership. And when Kody protested that the family needed reliable transport, she coolly reminded the court that the title had been placed solely in Robyn's name, not in the family LLC, and asked him whether using Janelle's money to purchase a car she could neither drive nor sell truly served the family as a whole, or only one favored part of it. He had no answer, only a glare, and the room watched as his composure crumbled while Reading marched him through further expenditures, each one tightening the noose. Finally, with her trap complete, she asked the simplest question of all. If he were to die, interests, who would legally inherit the contents of that private account. He admitted, after another long pause, that it would be Robyn, and Robyn alone, and in that moment the argument was over. Reading summarized, her voice still calm, that he had taken money from his wives, placed it in a private slush fund, and spent it for the sole benefit of himself and his favorite wife. And in that instant, the mask slipped for good. What followed was no longer testimony, but tirade. An eruption described by every witness as unforgettable. The primal roar of a man whose authority had been stripped bare, Kody surging forward in his chair, his voice booming through the chamber as he bellowed of the sacrifices he had made. How he had built a family from nothing, how he had borne pressures no one else could bear, and pointing a trembling finger at reading herself, accusing her of ignorance, of not understanding loyalty, covenant, eternal principles. Proclaiming that when his wives joined him, they had pledged their lives and fortunes to him as their leader, that their money was his to command. And the judge's attempts to call him to order fell to dust as he turned his fury upon Janelle and Christine, accusing Janelle of betrayal, Christine of poisoning her with bitterness, spitting that Christine had never respected the patriarchal order, that she had sought to destroy his kingdom from within. His own lawyer pleading for restraint as Kody only escalated, until at last, with the courtroom frozen in stunned silence, he shouted the words that defined the trial, that he was the leader, that the money went where he said it went, that this had always been the deal, that he alone decided what was best, and that Janelle and Christine had chosen to trade eternal salvation for pennies, for betrayal, for bean counting. He declared that they had a king, and they had chosen chaos. And with that final roar, he collapsed into silence, chest heaving, his face crimson, glaring across the room not as a patriarch but as a fallen king raging from a wooden throne. Reading, unflinching, merely looked to the judge and said she had no further questions. The trial from that moment was finished. Kody Brown had become the prosecution's star witness against himself. His own words, his own arrogance, his own volcanic confession, more damning than any ledger. 2 weeks later, the judge's ruling came blistering in its language, awarding Janelle not only the full $385,000, but significant punitive damages. The judgment citing Kody's utter lack of remorse, his breathtaking arrogance, his flagrant breach of fiduciary duty, and most damning of all, his narcissistic rant as the final. Undeniable evidence that he believed himself above law and fairness, above accountability, above everyone. In the end, it was not the paperwork, nor the witnesses, nor even the forensic accountants who destroyed him. It was Kody himself. His performance from the stand, not a salvation, but the most expensive monologue of his life. A self-dug grave sealed with the sound of his own voice.